The desert was quiet. The wind rolled across the sand, whispering secrets of men who once rode there, men whose names were written in dust and blood. And among those names, one stood out like a gunshot in the night. Curly Bill Brocius. No one knew exactly where he came from. Some said Texas, others swore he rode from Missouri or New Mexico. But wherever he came from, he carried something the West would never forget: his laugh. A wild, reckless, fearless laugh that made even the bravest men uneasy. Curly Bill's real name was William Brocius. At least that's what most believed. Back then, records were as loose as the law itself. But everyone agreed on one thing: this man was different. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he wasn't gentle either. He lived on the edge, like a man who had already looked death in the eyes and found it amusing. He first appeared in history around 1878 or 1879, drifting into Arizona territory like a tumbleweed that had lost its way. The towns there were young and wild: Tombstone, Charleston, Galeyville, places filled with gold seekers, gamblers, and gunmen. There were no real rules, only survival. And that was something Curly Bill understood better than most. He wasn't a quiet man. He loved to drink, tell jokes, and pull pranks on anyone who got close. People said he could make you laugh one moment and scare you to death the next. He didn't ride alone for long. Soon he joined a rough group of cowboys, men who rustled cattle, smuggled whiskey, and lived outside the law. They were known simply as the Cowboys. Among them were names that would one day become legends: Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, Johnny Ringo. And in the middle of them all stood Curly Bill, smiling under his hat, always ready for the next fight or the next drink. To the law, the cowboys were criminals. To each other, they were family. They looked out for one another when no one else would. They rode together, fought together, and when necessary, died together. Curly Bill wasn't just a gunfighter. He was a natural leader. He didn't command by force, but by charm. He had that rare kind of energy that made men want to follow him. Even his enemies couldn't deny his charisma. He could walk into a saloon filled with tension and turn it into laughter with just a few words. But beneath that humor, there was danger. Everyone knew that if you crossed him, his laughter could turn into lightning. He had a reputation for being both funny and deadly, like a man who didn't take life seriously because he knew how easily it could end. And maybe that's why people feared him. Not because he was the fastest gun, but because he truly didn't care if he lived or died. The desert nights were his stage. He would sit by the fire, his revolver spinning in his hand, telling stories of outlaws and ghosts. Sometimes when the fire burned low, someone would ask him why he laughed so much. He would shrug, grin, and say, "When death comes for me, I want to be smiling." That way, he won't know he's won. No one knew if he meant it as a joke or a promise. In Tombstone, Curly Bill became both a legend and a problem. The town was growing fast, full of miners chasing silver, gamblers chasing luck, and lawmen chasing both. But where there's gold and greed, there's always trouble. The cowboys ran the land outside the city, controlling cattle trails and smuggling routes. Inside town, the law belonged to men like Wyatt Earp and Marshal Fred White, men who believed the badge still meant something. That clash was bound to happen. And when it did, it would change everything. One night, Curly Bill rode into Tombstone drunk and laughing, as usual. He and his men fired shots into the air, celebrating nothing but the thrill of being alive. Marshal Fred White stepped out to stop them. He was respected, calm, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. He walked up to Curly Bill and asked for his gun, not with anger, but with quiet authority. Curly Bill smiled and twirled the revolver around his finger. The crowd watched, holding its breath. Then suddenly, the gun went off. Marshal White fell, clutching his stomach. The laughter stopped. The night turned cold. Wyatt Earp rushed in, slammed Curly Bill against the wall, and took his gun. The outlaw didn't fight back. He just stared at Wyatt and laughed softly. He was arrested and locked up, waiting for trial. The townspeople wanted justice, maybe even revenge. But when the case was heard, witnesses said the shooting had been an accident. Even the dying marshal forgave him before passing away, so Curly Bill was set free. Still, the line had been drawn, between the lawmen and the cowboys, between Wyatt Earp and Curly Bill. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. When Curly Bill rode out of town that day, he didn't look like a man who had escaped death. He looked like a man who had shaken its hand. His laughter echoed through the desert once again, louder, darker, and somehow hollow. Because deep down, he knew that one day soon, death would laugh back. The West was changing. Law was coming, and the old ways were dying. But Curly Bill Brocius, he wasn't about to fade quietly. The sun burned hot over the Arizona desert. Dust rose behind every horse, and the air smelled like gunpowder and whiskey. Out here, a man's worth was measured by how long he could stay alive. And in that wild, unforgiving land, one name was spreading fast: Curly Bill Brocius. He had left Tombstone for a while after the shooting of Marshal Fred White. The people whispered his name with both fear and curiosity. Some said he was a murderer. Others said it was all just a bad accident. But Curly Bill didn't care what anyone thought. He rode out into the hills laughing, as if the whole thing was just another story to tell. Curly Bill was not a man who followed rules. He lived like the wind, wild, free, and unpredictable. He could spend one night drinking and singing in a saloon, and the next morning be miles away, chasing cattle across the desert. He had a way of turning even his crimes into adventures. When he laughed, the men around him laughed too. He made trouble look like fun, and that's why others followed him. He didn't order people. He inspired them. He made outlaw life feel like a game, where danger was just another kind of entertainment. By the early 1880s, Curly Bill had become one of the most famous members of the Cochise County Cowboys, the largest and wildest outlaw group in southern Arizona. They weren't called cowboys, like today's heroes. Back then, the word meant something else: a rustler, a smuggler, a man who broke the law for a living. Their main business was cattle rustling, stealing cows from Mexico and selling them to ranchers in Arizona. They also ran whiskey, robbed stagecoaches, and sometimes even worked as hired guns. But through it all, they saw themselves as free men, not criminals. To them, the law was just another kind of outlaw, one that wore a badge. Curly Bill had a strange kind of charm. He could make people like him, even the ones who should have hated him. He'd ride into town, pay for everyone's drinks, tell wild stories, and vanish before morning. He'd joke with the same people he robbed a week later. He never took life too seriously, not even his own, and that made him dangerous. He was also known for his humor. Once, when a preacher tried to warn him about sin, Curly Bill smiled and said, "If heaven's got no whiskey or dancing, I'll take my chances in hell." The people around him burst out laughing. But deep down, they knew he meant it. He wasn't evil. He was untamed, a man who didn't fit anywhere peace tried to exist. The cowboys soon had enemies, not just the law, but the people of Tombstone itself. The town was growing rich from silver mines, and its businessmen wanted order, not chaos. But the cowboys controlled the land outside the town, the trails, the ranches, the back roads. They believed Tombstone belonged to them too, and standing against them was a man named Wyatt Earp. Wyatt was everything Curly Bill wasn't: quiet, disciplined, a believer in the rule of law. He and his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, had come to Tombstone to bring order to the chaos. They wore badges. The cowboys wore guns. The line between them was drawn, even if no one said it out loud. Curly Bill and Wyatt Earp met more than once, often in tense silence. Both men understood each other in a strange way. They were opposites, but also mirrors. Wyatt fought for the law. Curly Bill fought for freedom. But deep down, both men loved the same thing: control, and sooner or later, one would have to lose it. Curly Bill began to gain power inside the cowboy gang. While others used violence to lead, he used laughter. He knew how to make men follow him, not out of fear, but out of loyalty. He shared his loot, treated everyone equally, and never asked a man to do something he wouldn't do himself. When a rider fell behind, Curly Bill waited. When someone got caught by the law, he tried to help them escape. In that way, he became more than a leader. He became a legend. But the more his legend grew, the more trouble it brought. Stagecoaches were being robbed more often. Cattle disappeared in the night. And every time the Earps tried to stop it, the cowboys pushed back harder. It wasn't just crime anymore. It was war without rules. Curly Bill wasn't looking for blood. But when the law came after his friends, he didn't run. He stood his ground. That's who he was. The kind of man who laughed at death because he'd already made peace with it. One evening, as the sun sank behind the desert, Curly Bill sat around a campfire with his men. The whiskey bottle passed from hand to hand. Someone asked him, "Bill, do you ever think this'll all end?" Curly Bill smiled, watching the flames dance in the dark. "Everything ends," he said. "The trick is to enjoy it before it does." The men laughed. But there was something in his eyes, a shadow, a warning. Because deep down, Curly Bill knew the end was already coming. He just didn't know how close it was. As the stars filled the Arizona sky, the laughter of the cowboys echoed across the desert, wild, free, untamed. They didn't know it yet, but history was closing in. And soon, the fight between Curly Bill and Wyatt Earp would explode into something far greater than a gunfight. It would become the story that defined the Wild West. The line between law and outlaw was fading fast, and in the middle stood a laughing man named Curly Bill. The moon hung low over Tombstone. The streets shimmered with dust, and the air was thick with whiskey, smoke, and music spilling out of every saloon door. It was another restless night in a town that never slept, a place where law and chaos shared the same bed, and somewhere in the middle of that night, Curly Bill Brocius was laughing. He had been drinking for hours, surrounded by friends and strangers alike. The cowboys had ridden into town to celebrate a good haul, cattle sold, whiskey bought, and silver in their pockets. Laughter echoed through Allen Street, the heart of Tombstone. Men shouted. Horses neighed. Pistols flashed like toys in the moonlight. Curly Bill, already drunk and cheerful, walked out of a saloon with a revolver in his hand. He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just having fun, firing shots into the air and making the crowd scatter with nervous smiles. To him it was a game. To everyone else, it was trouble waiting to happen. Down the street, Marshal Fred White heard the gunfire. Fred was a good man, respected, calm, and fair. He had kept Tombstone peaceful when no one else could. But tonight, the peace was slipping through his fingers. He stepped out into the street, coat buttoned, badge shining faintly under the gaslight. The night wind carried the echoes of laughter and gunshots straight to him. He knew the voice. It was unmistakable. "That's Curly Bill," he muttered under his breath. Fred walked forward slowly, not with fear, but with quiet confidence. He had faced drunks, gamblers, and killers before. He believed every man could be reasoned with, even Curly Bill. As he approached, the crowd began to pull back. The laughter died down, and there stood Curly Bill, his revolver still smoking, his eyes glassy but amused. "Evening, Marshal," he shouted, grinning. "Just keeping the stars awake." Fred didn't smile. He raised a steady hand and said, "Put the gun down, Bill. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The people around them froze. They knew what could happen in a blink. One wrong move, one bad word, and the street would explode. Curly Bill looked at the gun, then at Fred. He tilted his head, still smiling that dangerous smile. Then, slowly, he walked forward, holding the revolver by the barrel, offering it to the marshal. The crowd relaxed, just a little. Fred reached out to take the gun. And in that single heartbeat, it happened. The revolver went off, a flash. A deafening crack. Fred White gasped and stumbled back, clutching his stomach. The echo of the shot rolled down the street like thunder. Curly Bill froze, his smile vanishing. For a moment he just stared, confused, horrified. He hadn't meant to pull the trigger. He was drunk, careless, and unlucky. Fred fell to his knees, eyes wide with pain. The townspeople screamed. Someone shouted for help, and from the darkness, heavy footsteps came running. Wyatt Earp. Wyatt burst onto the scene like a storm. He saw the marshal bleeding on the ground and Curly Bill standing there, gun in hand. Without hesitation, Wyatt charged forward. He slammed the outlaw against the wall, knocking the revolver away. "You've done it now, Bill," he barked. Curly Bill didn't fight back. He didn't reach for another weapon. He just looked at Wyatt and laughed softly. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of a man who couldn't believe what just happened. A man caught between guilt and disbelief. "It was an accident, Wyatt," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." Wyatt shoved him again, fury burning in his eyes. But before he could strike, Virgil Earp arrived and took control. The Earps dragged Curly Bill to jail as the crowd followed, shouting, cursing, spitting. By sunrise, Tombstone was boiling with anger. Fred White survived through the night but was fading fast. When Wyatt came to visit him, Fred managed a weak smile. "Don't blame him, Wyatt," he said. "It was an accident. The gun just went off. And with that, the marshal's final words cleared Curly Bill's name, legally, but not in the hearts of the people. Fred Wyatt died a few hours later, and Tombstone would never be the same again. Curly Bill was tried soon after. Witnesses confirmed that Fred had been shot by accident. The court released him, but when he walked out of that jail, there were no cheers, only silence. The people of Tombstone watched him ride away, his laughter echoing faintly through the streets one last time. To them, he was a murderer set free. To the cowboys, he was a hero who had beaten the law, and to Wyatt Earp, he was the beginning of war. That night, as Curly Bill rode out into the desert, the sky was dark and silent. He stopped at the top of a ridge, looking down at the lights of Tombstone flickering below. For the first time in a long time, he didn't laugh. He just sat there, turning Fred Wyatt's name over in his mind, and whispered, "Didn't mean to, Marshal. Didn't mean to." Then he rode off, swallowed by the night. The desert kept his secret, but the town of Tombstone would never forget, because in that one drunken moment, Curly Bill Brocius's fate was sealed. The accident changed everything. The law no longer trusted the laughter of Curly Bill, and the cowboys were about to face a new enemy, the Earps. The desert around Tombstone had grown quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, heavy, tense, waiting to explode. The shooting of Marshal Fred Wyatt had changed everything. Curly Bill Brocius had walked free but not forgiven. In the eyes of the law, it was an accident. In the hearts of the people, it was murder. Tombstone was no longer just a mining town. It had become a battlefield, a place split clean down the middle between two worlds. On one side stood the cowboys, wild and lawless, living by their own rules. On the other, the Earps, men of order, trying to bring justice to a land that didn't want it. Curly Bill had gone back to the open country, far from the dusty streets that now hated him. He spent his days riding the wide plains where the law could not reach. He still laughed, still joked, but something inside him had changed. His laughter was darker now, quieter, the laughter of a man who knew his time was running out. Around him, the Cochise County cowboys were growing stronger. They were everywhere, rustling cattle, robbing stagecoaches, smuggling whiskey from Mexico. They were wild men, free men, and they followed Curly Bill like he was their captain. Not because he demanded it, but because he lived exactly as they wanted to live, free and fearless. Back in Tombstone, Wyatt Earp had not forgotten. He remembered the look on Curly Bill's face that night, the half-smile, the disbelief, the quiet laugh after the gun went off. He told himself it had been an accident, but deep down, something about it burned. Maybe it was the marshal's death. Maybe it was the way the cowboys walked around like the law meant nothing. Or maybe it was personal. Wyatt was a man of rules. He believed in control, in justice, in lines that should never be crossed. And to him, Curly Bill had crossed them all. The Earps had taken positions of power in Tombstone. Virgil Earp became the town marshal. Morgan Earp worked as his deputy. Wyatt, though not wearing a badge at the time, stood behind them, quiet but ready. And together, they began to tighten their grip on the town. The cowboys didn't like that one bit. They saw the Earps as outsiders, men who came to take what wasn't theirs. Tombstone, in their eyes, was cowboy country. And as long as Curly Bill lived, that wasn't going to change. The tension grew with every sunrise. One side carried badges, the other carried bullets. Bars filled with whispers, stories of ambushes, stolen cattle, secret meetings in the desert. The town was divided, not just by law, but by loyalty. You could walk down Allen Street and tell who was who just by the way they looked at you. If you were with the Earps, you kept your hand near your gun. If you were with the cowboys, you kept your back to the wall. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Curly Bill was still laughing. One evening, he rode into Tombstone again. He wanted whiskey, and he wasn't the kind of man who hid from ghosts. The saloon doors creaked as he walked in, spurs jingling, hat tilted low. The piano stopped. All eyes turned to him. He ordered a drink, tossed a silver coin on the bar, and grinned. "Relax, boys," he said. "I ain't shooting nobody tonight." A few men laughed nervously, but the silence that followed was heavy. Curly Bill took his drink, tipped his hat, and walked out into the street. He knew Wyatt Earp was watching from somewhere in the shadows. He could almost feel it. The respect between them had turned to something else, something colder. Weeks passed and the unease grew. Fights broke out between cowboys and townsfolk. A robbery here, a killing there. Each time, suspicion pointed toward Curly Bill's gang. Each time, Wyatt and his brothers answered with more pressure. It was no longer about justice. It was about control. And then came Johnny Ringo, a name that brought even more fire. He was smart, fast, and mean, a gunslinger with a temper to match. He and Curly Bill became close friends, almost brothers. Together, they led the cowboys deeper into rebellion. Where Curly Bill brought charm and laughter, Ringo brought rage and precision. The combination was deadly. Soon, the cowboys weren't just outlaws. They were an army without a flag. They ruled the roads around Tombstone. No wagon, no stagecoach, no rancher was safe. People started locking their doors before dark. And the Earps began carrying their guns everywhere they went. It was only a matter of time before someone fired the first shot. And everyone knew it. Even Curly Bill. One night, as the campfire burned low, he stared into the flames, silent for once. Johnny Ringo noticed and asked, "What's on your mind, Bill?" Curly Bill smiled faintly. "Tombstone," he said. "It's a fine town. But it ain't big enough for all of us." The wind blew hard through the camp, scattering sparks into the dark. And just like that, the line was drawn. By the end of 1881, Tombstone was ready to explode. On one side, the cowboys, led by Curly Bill and Ringo. On the other, the Earps and Doc Holliday, waiting for justice. All it needed was one spark, one misunderstanding, to turn the tension into blood, and that spark would come soon. In a dusty little lot behind a corral filled with horses, the laughter was fading, replaced by the sound of cocked revolvers. The morning of October 26, 1881, began like any other in Tombstone, Arizona. The air was dry. The wind carried the smell of dust and horses. But under that quiet sky, a storm was coming. Everyone in town could feel it. The kind of tension that made dogs bark and shutters close early. Tombstone wasn't just a town anymore. It was a battlefield waiting for a reason, and that reason had finally arrived. The cowboys had been stirring up trouble again, drinking, shouting, and flashing their guns in the street. Among them were Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank. They'd been warning everyone that the Earps were finished, that the cowboys ruled this town now. Curly Bill Brocius wasn't in town that morning. He was out on the range, but his shadow hung heavy over the cowboys who were there. He was their symbol, the man who laughed at the law and got away with it. To the cowboys, he was proof that the Earps could bleed, and today they planned to show it. Inside the Crystal Palace saloon, Wyatt Earp sat quietly, sipping black coffee. He hadn't slept much. He'd heard the rumors that Ike Clanton was gunning for him. His brothers Virgil and Morgan and his friend Doc Holliday joined him at the table. They spoke in low voices. They all knew something had to give. Virgil, the town marshal, set down his cup. "They're down by the OK Corral," he said. "Loaded up and drunk. If we don't stop this, someone innocent's gonna get hurt." Wyatt looked up slowly, eyes hard. "Then let's end it," he said. Doc Holliday smiled faintly, his voice rough. "I was hoping you'd say that." The streets filled with whispers as the four men stepped out into the sunlight. Virgil Earp carried a shotgun. Morgan had his revolver at his side. Doc Holliday, pale and coughing, hid a short shotgun beneath his coat. Wyatt Earp walked in the middle, calm as a man walking to church. Each step echoed against the wooden boardwalk. People peeked through windows. Mothers pulled their children inside. The air was so thick with fear you could almost taste it. At the other end of town, behind the OK Corral, the cowboys waited. Ike Clanton paced nervously, shouting curses. Tom McClory checked his pistol. Billy Clanton spat in the dirt. The sun glared off their gun barrels. They weren't heroes or villains, just men who'd gone too far to turn back. When they saw the Earps walking toward them, the talking stopped. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the wind whistling between the buildings. Virgil raised his hand. "Throw up your hands, boys," he said. "We're here to disarm you." For a moment, time froze. A horse snorted. A door creaked. Then someone, no one knows who, pulled a gun, and the world exploded. The first shots were deafening. Flashes of fire filled the narrow lot. Men ducked, shouted, fired blindly through smoke. Doc Holliday stepped forward, his shotgun roaring. Morgan Earp staggered as a bullet tore through his coat. Wyatt kept firing, calm, steady, like he'd been born for this. In less than 30 seconds, 30 shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, the street was littered with dust and blood. Billy Clanton and Tom McClory lay dying. Frank McClory was already dead. Virgil and Morgan were wounded. Doc Holliday was coughing hard, his hands trembling, and Wyatt Earp stood untouched, calm, silent, like a man carved from stone. The gunfight lasted less than half a minute, but it would echo for more than a century. Tombstone was never the same. Some called it justice, others called it murder, but everyone agreed on one thing. The West had changed that day. Out in the desert, miles away, Curly Bill Brocius got the news. A rider brought it to him at sunset. The cowboys had lost. 3 of their men were dead, and the Earps were still standing. Curly Bill listened quietly, then smiled. "Well," he said, "looks like the game started for real." He poured himself a drink and stared out across the red horizon. He wasn't angry, not yet. He just laughed softly, the way only he could. "Tell the boys," he said, "we're not done." That laugh carried across the desert, through the wind and the smoke, like a warning or a promise. Because the gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The cowboys would seek revenge, and Curly Bill Brocius would lead them. Tombstone had drawn its line in blood. The Earps had won the gunfight, but they'd made enemies who wouldn't forgive. The sun had barely set on the gunfight at the OK Corral, and already the town of Tombstone was drowning in whispers. Some called it justice, others called it murder, but everyone knew it wasn't over. The 3 dead cowboys, Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory, were laid in the ground with their boots still on. Hundreds came to watch their funerals. The cowboys rode through town dressed in black, their faces hard, their eyes full of vengeance. And among them was Curly Bill Brocius. He stood silently by the graves, hat over his heart. When the last shovel of dirt fell, he lifted his head and said softly, "They won a gunfight, but they haven't won the war." Curly Bill had stayed out of Tombstone the day of the shootout, but the news hit him like a bullet. The Earps had humiliated his people. They'd killed his friends, his brothers in arms. And in the world of the cowboys, that kind of blood didn't dry. It screamed for payback. That night, Curly Bill gathered his men around a fire deep in the desert. The flames cracked and danced in their eyes. Johnny Ringo sat beside him, silent, cleaning his gun. Curly Bill spoke slowly, his voice calm but cold. "They think the law protects them," he said. "But out here, the desert's the only law that matters." The men nodded. They didn't need more words. They knew what was coming. Tombstone fell under a dark cloud. The cowboys wanted revenge, and they would get it piece by piece. A few weeks after the gunfight, Virgil Earp, the town marshal, was ambushed while walking home. Gunfire tore through the night. Bullets shattered his arm and shoulder. He barely survived. People whispered that Curly Bill himself had planned the attack. No one could prove it, but everyone believed it. Because that's how he worked, silent, unseen, but always close enough to remind you he was still laughing. Then came another blow. Morgan Earp, Wyatt's younger brother, was shot and killed while playing billiards one evening. The bullet came through the window, striking him in the back. He fell without a sound. Wyatt rushed to him, held him in his arms, and Morgan's last words broke what little peace was left. "Don't let them get away, Wyatt." That night, something inside Wyatt Earp snapped. The lawman turned into something else, something darker. And now, the chase went both ways. Curly Bill and the cowboys rode hard across the desert, hiding in canyons and ghost towns. Wyatt Earp formed a posse, a small group of men who no longer cared about the badge, only justice. They called it the Earp Vendetta Ride. The hunters had become the hunted, and every mile brought them closer to the man Wyatt blamed for everything, Curly Bill Brocius. Meanwhile, Curly Bill was changing too. He still laughed, still drank, still played the fool around the fire, but those who knew him said his eyes had grown tired. The wild sparkle was fading. He talked less and stared longer at the horizon. He knew how these stories ended. He'd seen too many men ride into gunfire thinking they were immortal. He'd buried too many of them himself, but he couldn't walk away now. Not after Morgan, not after Virgil, not after the graves in Tombstone. Revenge wasn't just coming, it was all he had left. One night, Curly Bill and Johnny Ringo sat together under the stars. The campfire flickered low. "You ever think about just leaving?" Ringo asked quietly. "Mexico's close. We could vanish." Curly Bill smiled faintly. "And do what?" "Live like ghosts? The desert's my home, Johnny. Always has been. If death wants me, he knows where to find me." Ringo nodded. They sat in silence, listening to the wind. Far away, thunder rolled, or maybe it was gunfire. No one could tell anymore. Back in Tombstone, Wyatt Earp buried his brother and made a vow. He would hunt down every man who had a hand in the killings. No court, no jury, only bullets. He and his posse rode out of town under gray skies, their faces cold, their hearts burning. Their first target, Curly Bill Brocius. Curly Bill heard they were coming. He laughed, not out of joy but out of disbelief. "Wyatt's coming for me," he said. Well, I'd hate to disappoint him. He knew the fight was inevitable. He could have run. He could have vanished into Mexico like some said he planned. But that wasn't Curly Bill's way. He'd lived his whole life laughing in the face of danger, and he'd die the same way if it came to that. The desert was quiet again. The same desert that had watched him rise was now waiting to watch him fall. The wind carried the smell of rain, the sound of distant hoofbeats, and the faint echo of laughter, the laugh of a man who knew his story was almost over. Wyatt Earp was on the trail, and the storm was about to break. Curly Bill Brocius, the laughing outlaw, had one fight left, a fight that would decide not just his fate, but the legend of the West itself. The desert stretched endlessly, silent and cruel. Wind whipped across the dry plains carrying dust, ghosts, and memories of men who'd died chasing revenge. Wyatt Earp rode at the head of his posse. 6 men, each armed to the teeth, each burning with purpose. They were no longer lawmen. They were avengers, and they had only one name left on their list, Curly Bill Brocius. For days they had followed his trail, faint hoofprints in the sand, smoke from dying campfires, and whispers from frightened ranchers. Curly Bill was out there, somewhere between Iron Springs and Mescal Canyon, hiding with a handful of cowboys. He knew Wyatt was coming, and Wyatt knew this time there would be no arrests, no trials, only death. The air was heavy that morning. Gray clouds rolled in from the west. Rain threatened but never fell. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Curly Bill and his men were camped near a shallow creek at Iron Springs, their horses tied close, their guns never far from reach. They had spent the night talking, laughing, pretending that the world wasn't closing in. At sunrise, Curly Bill poured himself a tin cup of coffee and looked toward the horizon. The desert shimmered in the distance. He smiled faintly. "He's coming," he said. "I can feel it." Johnny Barnes, one of his men, laughed nervously. "You think Wyatt's crazy enough to face us out here?" Curly Bill chuckled, slow and low. "He ain't crazy, Johnny. He's just done being scared." By mid-morning, Wyatt and his posse reached the edge of the canyon. They dismounted quietly. The only sound was the creak of saddles and the whisper of boots in sand. Wyatt raised his hand. "They're here," he said. He stepped forward through the brush, his long coat moving with the wind. The others followed, Doc Holliday, Sherman McMasters, and a few others who had sworn vengeance alongside him. When they reached the open flat near the creek, Wyatt saw smoke rising, the cowboys' camp. Curly Bill stood up slowly. He saw them too. Their eyes met across the distance. 2 men, 2 legends, both shaped by the same desert, now facing each other for the last time. Wyatt shouted, "Curly Bill!" "It ends today." The cowboys scrambled for their guns. In an instant, the silence shattered. Bullets screamed across the open ground. The air filled with dust and gunpowder. Wyatt charged straight into the gunfire. Bullets tore through his coat, cutting the air around him. One struck his boot, another grazed his side, but he never stopped moving. He raised his double-barreled shotgun and fired both barrels at once. The blast thundered through the canyon. Curly Bill was hit square in the chest. He stumbled back, eyes wide, shock frozen on his face. For a split second he looked as if he might laugh again, but this time, no sound came out. He fell backward into the dirt, the echo of the shotgun rolling through the desert like a final drumbeat. The gunfight raged for a few more seconds, shouting, smoke, and flashes of steel. When it ended, several cowboys were dead or wounded. The rest scattered into the hills. Wyatt stood alone in the middle of the clearing, breathing hard, his gun still smoking. Rain began to fall, slow, cold drops cutting through the dust. He looked down at Curly Bill's body. For the first time in a long time, he felt no anger. Only silence. "You laughed at death," he whispered. Guess death laughed back. Wyatt holstered his gun and turned away. He didn't take trophies. He didn't say another word. He just mounted his horse and rode off through the rain, leaving the desert to bury the outlaw who had once owned it. Back at camp that evening, the men were quiet. Doc Holliday broke the silence. "So it's done," he said. Wyatt nodded. "It's done." But deep down, he knew it would never really be over. Killing Curly Bill hadn't brought peace, only the end of one story and the beginning of another. For days after, the wind whispered through Iron Springs. Some said if you rode through there at night, you could still hear laughter in the dark, a soft mocking laugh that faded as the wind rose. Maybe it was just the echo of memory, or maybe Curly Bill's spirit never really left the desert he loved. He had lived fast, laughed harder, and died the way he wanted, facing death without fear. And though his body turned to dust, his legend never did. Historians would later argue about what truly happened that day. Some claimed Wyatt never found his body. Others swore Curly Bill escaped south to Mexico, living out his last years under another name, still laughing at the law. But the story that lived on, the one told around campfires and saloons, was this. Curly Bill Brocius died as he lived, with a grin on his face and the sound of gunfire in his ears. The desert took Curly Bill, but his legend only grew. Stories of his courage and his laughter spread across the frontier. The wind still howled across Iron Springs, long after the gunfire had faded. The desert was silent again, but not empty. It carried echoes of the men who had fought there. Their laughter, their anger, their ghosts. And somewhere in that silence, the story of Curly Bill Brocius refused to die. After the battle, Wyatt Earp and his posse rode away without looking back. They had done what they came for. They left the body of Curly Bill where it fell, face down in the sand, his revolver still in his hand, his trademark grin frozen even in death. But when they returned to Tombstone, something strange began to happen. Some said the cowboys went back to the site days later, and Curly Bill's body was gone. No one knew who took it. No one knew where he went. The desert had swallowed him, as if the land itself refused to let him rest. Word spread fast. Some believed Wyatt had killed him. Others swore Curly Bill had survived, wounded but alive, crawling away through the brush to safety. Rumors grew into stories, and stories became legend. They said he rode south, across the border into Mexico, living under a new name. They said he grew a beard, traded his guns for a ranch, and spent his last years laughing by the fire, telling tales of the man they thought was dead. No one ever proved it. But in the Wild West, proof didn't matter. What mattered was the story, and Curly Bill's story was too good to end. In the saloons of Arizona and the ranches of Texas, men still spoke his name with awe. They said he was dangerous, yes, but fair. Wild but free. He wasn't cruel for the sake of it. He was a man who lived without chains. To some, he was a villain. To others, he was the very spirit of the frontier, bold, reckless, and untamed. There were men who had never met him but swore they'd heard his laughter on the wind at night, rolling through the canyons like a ghost that refused to fade. Wyatt Earp never spoke much about Iron Springs. When asked years later if he truly killed Curly Bill, he simply said, "He drew first." I finished it, but even Wyatt couldn't escape the shadow of that day. For every outlaw he buried, another legend rose, and the one that refused to die was Curly Bill Brocius. Time passed. The frontier began to change. Towns grew, railroads came, and the old world of outlaws and gunslingers started to vanish. The wild men of the desert were replaced by law, order, and fences. But Curly Bill didn't fit inside fences. He belonged to the open sky, the last of a dying breed. The world was moving on, but his name stayed behind, echoing like a memory that refused to fade. Writers and storytellers picked up his tale. Some painted him as a ruthless killer, others as a misunderstood outlaw who never wanted fame, just freedom. His story became a mirror for the West itself, part truth, part myth, all fire. They said he could charm anyone. They said his laughter could calm a crowd or start a gunfight. They said that when death finally came for him, he faced it like an old friend. In the years that followed, people claimed to see him, a stranger in dusty towns with curly hair and a crooked smile, riding an old horse through the desert at sundown. Some swore he tipped his hat, laughed softly, and rode on without a word. Whether it was his ghost, his memory, or just the imagination of a land haunted by its past, no one ever knew for sure. Curly Bill Brocius had become more than a man. He was a symbol, a reminder of a time when the West was still wild, when laughter could be as deadly as a bullet, and when men like him lived by their own code. Not right, not wrong, just free. He once said, "If death wants me, he knows where to find me." And maybe that was the secret of his legend. He never feared death, so death could never really take him. Today, more than a century later, his name still drifts through Western songs, movies, and stories. Some remember him as a killer, some call him a hero, but everyone agrees Curly Bill Brocius was unforgettable. He was the man who laughed at death, and somehow death laughed back. But never won. Time moved on, but his legend stayed. The name Curly Bill Brocius became part of Western folklore, half man, half myth. Who was Curly Bill Brocius, really? Even after his death, or supposed death, no one seemed to know for sure. He was a man of many names, many stories, and too many legends to count. Some said he was born in Texas, others claimed Missouri. A few swore he came from South Carolina, a runaway farm boy who turned drifter. His real name might have been William Graham, or William Bresnahan, or Brocius. No one could agree. The truth was buried as deep as the desert sand that swallowed him. What people did agree on was this: Curly Bill Brocius lived like a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. He didn't have a home, a wife, or a past that anyone could trace. He was a shadow that laughed, a gun that shone in the sun, a man who rode into history without leaving tracks behind. When you tried to follow his story, it twisted like smoke. Every time you thought you had him, he slipped away again. Some old-timers claimed he'd once been a cowhand in Texas, a good one, hard worker, quick with a joke, loved by everyone. But something happened, a fight, maybe a killing, and he vanished overnight. A few years later, a man with curly hair and a big laugh appeared in Arizona, calling himself Curly Bill. Same grin, same charm, same habit of finding trouble wherever he went. Maybe that was him. Maybe it wasn't. But in the Wild West, names didn't matter as much as reputation. And his reputation was legend. Historians have argued for over a century about what really happened at Iron Springs. Did Wyatt Earp truly kill Curly Bill? Or did the outlaw cheat death one last time? According to Wyatt's own words, "I killed Curly Bill that day. Shot him square with both barrels. He went down and never moved again." But others weren't so sure. No one ever found his body, at least not one that could be proven. Some cowboys later swore they saw Curly Bill alive, riding south toward the Mexican border just days after the gunfight. One story claimed he became a rancher under a new name, married a Mexican woman, and lived quietly until old age. Another tale said he joined a band of smugglers and died years later in Sonora, still laughing, still untamed. The truth vanished with him. Curly Bill was the kind of man the frontier loved, part hero, part outlaw, impossible to define. He could kill a man and buy another a drink in the same hour. He could charm a crowd or terrify it with a single grin. He didn't follow the rules because he didn't believe in them. And in a world as lawless as the Arizona desert, that made him both a villain and a legend. Even those who hated him couldn't forget him. Wyatt Earp himself later said, "Curly Bill was as dangerous as they come. But I'll give him this: he wasn't a coward." The mystery of Curly Bill's life and death became a mirror for the Old West itself. A place where stories outlived men, where truth and myth blurred until no one could tell them apart. Was he a murderer who escaped justice? Or just a restless soul who got caught between law and freedom? Maybe he was both. Maybe that's why people never stopped talking about him. Even in modern times, writers, filmmakers, and historians still chase his ghost. Some call him a tragic figure, a man shaped by the chaos of his time. Others see him as the embodiment of rebellion, the laugh in the face of power, the smile under the hangman's noose, and maybe that's what made him timeless. Because Curly Bill didn't stand for good or evil. He stood for something deeper, the human hunger to live free, no matter the cost. If you walk through the Arizona desert today, you can still find the old trails the cowboys rode. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, when the wind moves through the mesquite and the sun sinks low, people say they hear it, a faint laugh, far off, carried by the wind. Maybe it's just the sound of the desert itself, or maybe it's Curly Bill, still laughing at death, still free, still untamed. History may never solve the mystery of who he was. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the legend is bigger than the man ever was, because Curly Bill Brocius wasn't just a person, he was an idea. The last echo of a time when men carved their own laws into the earth, when courage and madness shared the same face, and laughter could outlive the gunfire. The mystery of Curly Bill Brocius will never fade, because legends never die. But every legend has one final ride. The desert doesn't remember names. It remembers footsteps, gunfire, and the sound of laughter carried by the wind. And somewhere out there, between the ghost towns and the mountains, the name Curly Bill Brocius still lingers, like smoke that refuses to fade. Years had passed since the gunfight at Iron Springs. The West itself had begun to change. Railroads cut across the open plains, towns rose from dust, and the wild freedom that once defined the frontier was slowly fenced away. The old gunfighters were dying off, some by bullets, others by time, and those who remained alive became stories, legends told around campfires. Their faces remembered in paintings and words more than flesh. But among all those stories, one name stood out, the outlaw who laughed at death. Curly Bill Brocius. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something in between, a man made of contradictions. He could shoot faster than most, but he'd rather talk than kill. He broke laws, but he had a kind of code, his own rough sense of fairness. He wasn't cruel for pleasure. He just refused to kneel. And in a world that demanded obedience, that made him unforgettable. Historians tried to define him, but Curly Bill never belonged on paper. He belonged to the land and to the deserts of Arizona, to the dusty trails where men learned who they were by how long they could stay alive. He lived by one simple rule. If death comes for me, he'll have to catch me laughing. And maybe that's what people loved most about him, the laughter. The defiance. The refusal to be afraid. To the men who rode with him, he was a leader, not because he demanded it, but because he made life feel lighter, even when death was close. To the people of Tombstone, he was a menace, a ghost that kept the town trembling. And to Wyatt Earp, he was the enemy that made him a legend. Without Curly Bill, there would be no story of Wyatt Earp's Vendetta, no myth of the OK Corral, no echoes of the Wild West as we remember it. In a strange way, the outlaw and the lawman created each other. They were opposites, but they needed each other to become immortal. As the years rolled on, the truth of Curly Bill's life blurred into legend. Some said he died at Iron Springs. Others claimed he lived on in Mexico. But maybe the truth didn't matter anymore. Maybe the legend itself was enough, because Curly Bill became more than a man. He became a symbol of freedom, of rebellion, of laughter in the face of death. He was the last echo of a world that refused to be tamed. If you visit the old mining towns today, Tombstone, Charleston, Galeyville, you'll find his story written on the walls of saloons and the lips of old storytellers. They speak of him not as a ghost, but as an idea, a reminder that once, men like Curly Bill roamed the earth, wild, fearless, alive in a way most of us only dream of being. They lived without comfort, without rules, without tomorrow. But in doing so, they found something purer than safety, freedom. Even the desert seems to remember him. At night, when the wind blows across the dry plains, you can almost hear it. The faint sound of laughter drifting through the canyons, soft, carefree, as if he's still out there, riding the horizon, mocking death one last time, and maybe he is, because legends don't die where they fall. They live in the stories we tell. Curly Bill Brocius left behind no family, no riches, no gravestone with his name carved in stone. But he left something far more powerful, a legacy. A story that survived bullets, time, and truth. A reminder that the wild cannot be caged. That laughter can be stronger than fear. And that sometimes the man who stands outside the law ends up becoming part of history itself. His story is the story of the West, beautiful, brutal, and unforgettable. A place where men lived fast, died young, and became immortal through the tales they left behind. Curly Bill Brocius was one of those men. The outlaw who made death wait. The man who laughed his way into legend. The desert may take everything, your life, your friends, your name, but it can't take your legend. Curly Bill Brocius proved that. He lived free, he died fearless, and his laughter still rides the wind. Because in the end, legends never die.